Welcome to AskBYS Podcast, a monthly podcast brought to you by Bainbridge Youth Services and its supporting sponsors. AskBYS Podcast connects parents to professionals that can provide support, education, and resources on a particular topic in parenting. My name is Shannon Amalang, she, her pronouns, and I am your host. I am here with Milagro Castilleja, she, they pronouns, as our producer. We are recording live at the Media Arts Studio at BARN, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network. Today's episode is sponsored by Quick Lock and Windermere Realty of Bainbridge Island. We are happy to welcome our parent guest, Brynn Blanchard, who uses she, her pronouns, a Bainbridge Island resident and mother of two.
Hello, my name is Brynn. I'm happy to be here today.
And our professional guest, Dr. Mike Tomberg, who uses he, him pronouns, a parent of three and Bainbridge Island resident, and a family medicine doctor at Virginia Mason Franciscan Health.
Good morning. I'm honored to be here today.
It's great to have you both. Today's episode is Parenting and the Gender Spectrum, and we'll turn it over to Brynn.
Well, good morning, Dr. Tomberg.
Thank
you for being here today. As we discuss today's topic about the gender spectrum, I'd love to hear you describe what it means when someone identifies as transgender.
It's a great question, and I think that the definition, we can do it from a scientific perspective, but also just from a personal perspective, because we are talking about a gender spectrum, and I think it's really, we can define transgender as being somebody who feels different than the sex they were assigned at birth. So, for instance, if you were born and you had evidence of some male genitalia, you'd be assigned male at birth. But your internal understanding of who you are, who you love, how you experience yourself, and your own gender is different. And so you would be considered, you would understand yourself as being different than the sex you were assigned at birth. So your internal understanding of yourself is different than the external genitalia or the way that society treats you because of how you look externally, because your internal feelings are your authentic feelings about who you are and the gender you express and understand yourself to be.
I think a lot of people feel a little bit anxious sometimes when they're learning about topics like the gender spectrum, because there are people that they care about who may live at different points along the spectrum, and they don't want to say, use words that might be outdated or vocabulary that indicates they don't fully understand. And so I'm wondering if you can help us discuss or learn a little bit about the proper ways to discuss these topics using respectful terms and language, and particularly like, what is cisgender? What is transgender? Those are some areas where I think maybe we haven't always had the greatest understanding about what that means.
Thank you for asking. Language is very powerful, and I think it helps guide us in our understanding. It allows us to communicate more authentically with each other. So it is our responsibility to understand language. But it's also okay if you're a novice, right? So as you learn anything new, there may be some mistakes, and it's a matter of being open and curious, and with the intent to really open up better conversation and understanding of people. So that's why we have all this new terminology, and we live in a multi-generational household. So I have my parents, my mother, and my in-laws live with us. And I have three children, my youngest who is transgender. And so there's often conversations at the table and questions about what do I say, what do? I don't want to offend. And I think it's been a great opportunity for all of us to learn, to laugh a little bit about how we make mistakes. But ultimately, the goal is to come at it with love and curiosity and a desire for acceptance. And so I make mistakes too. We all do. That's part of it. But the desire is to really help treat your child or whoever that you encounter who may identify as transgender with respect and love and care. And so transgender means a different, trans means a cross. So it's a cross from what you were assigned at birth. So meaning that you identify as something different than your sex assigned at birth, as we discussed earlier. Cisgender means the same. So you identify as the same sex you were assigned at birth. So I'm a cisgender male, so that means I was assigned male at birth, and I identify as being a male, and I use pronouns he, him. So that's how we go. Whereas my child was assigned male at birth, but identifies as transgender, and she uses her preferred pronouns are she, her. Some people will, because we call it a gender spectrum, some people will identify as something not necessarily a binary or a male or female identity. Many people have a feeling that they are somewhere indifferent or in the middle, or something that is not easily described by some of our language. So they will sometimes use the preferred pronouns of they, them, or other pronouns that they will utilize to help identify their gender spectrum, which again may not fall under the binary, meaning one or the other, male or female. Often they're somewhere in between. And the earlier question, and I'm sorry I didn't respond to, is what's the difference between gender spectrum and sexual orientation? So that's a question that comes up very often. Sexual orientation is the person you are attracted to, you have romantic feelings for, you have erotic feelings for. That's your sexual orientation. That's different than your gender identity. You can be a cisgender male, meaning that you were assigned male at birth, you identify as being male, but you're attracted to other men. So that's your sexual orientation. You would identify as gay that way. Whereas you can be a transgender female and be attracted to men or women, and it's really your erotic, emotional, and romantic attraction that deals with sexual orientation versus your identity of your gender. So that's a way we determine those or distinguish those two definitions.
I think that's really helpful to think about as I realize that the conversations around gender and gender being a spectrum are new to some people. And as we think about advances that we've made in our cultural understanding of gender and sexual orientation, these are great things to be learning about. All coming to this learning with the idea of having respect for the people that we're dealing with, whether it's our colleagues or our friends, neighbors, or children, classmates. One question that I have is sometimes people who come out as transgender identify with not only new pronouns that more align with their gender identity, but sometimes they select a new name that notes that. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and maybe the implications for that within a family.
Yeah. And that's very common, actually, because it's really a wonderful opportunity for a child and a person to then take claim to who they are, and they get to define those things. And part of that is also by choosing a name. Our names are chosen for us. I didn't actually have a say in it. And so it's wonderful when somebody is coming out as transgender. They can also, not only do they, again, identify with different pronouns, but they can choose a different name that more authentically represents who they are. Because how they were named as a child was based upon they were assigned sex at birth, not necessarily who they were as an individual and what their gender identity is. And so our child, who is named Mason as growing up, now has chosen Macy. And so Mason is what's called a dead name. No longer is that used to identify who she is. And as a parent, and I will say that it's hard. I chose that name for a reason. I had all this named, I'm Jewish, and so we name a child after someone who's passed away. So that was chosen as a name. And yet I have to understand it and recognize that my child, it doesn't help them. It doesn't identify who they are. And so they've made a decision to change their name. And it's sort of beautiful for them to claim their own identity. And she chose to keep the same first letter, M, to honor the tradition in our household to be named after somebody, my father, Marty. So Macy is still there, and that's a beautiful way to have helped continue that tradition and honor that, but also to honor who they are and who she is as an individual. And it's hard as a parent because I knew them as a certain name for 16 years. And I find that for the most part, I'm really good about using their chosen name. However, I realize when I'm mad or sad, I revert back to it, which, and that's my own work. That has to be for something that I have to work on because I really want to make sure my child feels loved for who they are.
It's back to the dinosaur brain.
Yeah.
These deeply ingrained memories of words and language that we've used in the past with our kids. I think that what you mentioned about this being about respect, about your loved one's identity, I think the contrary can also be true. Folks who maybe misuse a former name to hurt someone who is transgender is something that we want to always remember, that when someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always really happy to meet other parents who are fully embracing the full spectrum of who we're learning our children to be. One thing that I love about conversations with you, Dr. Tomberg, is you have a broader perspective about gender dysphoria and how it shows up in our communities, in our families, in our schools, because of your medical practice. And so I'd love to learn more about how you see this expressed in your practice, mm-hmm. and maybe the age ranges of patients that you see coming through, and just tell us a little bit about how early or late gender can come into play. And
one of the things I should have said up front is that I'm not a member of the transgender community, so I always have to be careful not to make assumptions. It's very uncomfortable sometimes to have a group studied, right? And especially if you're not a member of that group, because it really you feel subjugated. And so I want to know that this is just my experience as a clinician, as a parent, but I'm also recognize that I'm human, and I want to make sure that I honor those people who have gone through this process, that I will never know what it's like. And I will have to make sure that I don't assume anything. So when I come at it as a clinician, it's important to understand and respect people are people, and they come in all shapes and sizes and all diversity. That is the beauty of being our species. And I would always tell people that when you look at a garden, if a garden were only one color, one size, something bloomed only at one time of the year, it would not be the beauty that it is. And so part of my joy of being a medical provider is because I get to experience and witness the beauty of the human diversity. And being transgender is part of human diversity, like so many other aspects of who we are. We live in a society, however, that really likes gender. So, for instance, there's often immediately these gender reveal parties, which I think are wild. And I joke in our family, I think gender reveal should happen at 18, right? Because I think that we don't allow for the breadth of the human experience. But we have so much that is tied up with gender. We can think about the roles we've set up in many cultures are so based upon gender. And so if you are growing up and you feel like you are different than the gender you were assigned at birth, there can be a lot of conflict because there's these expectations that society has of you and you have of yourself to play a role that doesn't feel authentic at all to you. And so many actions, because we think about gender colors so much mm-hmm. of our language and culture. So growing up, there's all these subtle ways that you sort of feel all the time inauthentic. And that's really hard on your psyche because you always feel like, God, this is not who I am, and I'm forced into this space. And so you're using all this energy to try to fit in when you can't really explore all the beauty of who you are as you are, right? And So what can happen is there can be dysphoria, which means euphoria is joy, dysphoria is angst or sadness regarding your gender, because there's so many aspects throughout your whole life that you feel that you are not appreciated truly for who you are, and you're forced to do something that you're not. So it can manifest different ways. And just like the diversity of human experience, gender will be expressed at different times in people's lives. And we'll find people who from a very early age will identify as a different gender than the sex they were assigned at birth. And so from early on, they want to dress in clothing as their gender identity, which may be different from their, the sex assigned at birth. And so, and I think parents we're a little bit more relaxed when it comes to young children, because we tend to think of children as not quite fully, developed into their gender, their sexuality, whatever it may be. So we're more comfortable with a little bit more diversity sometimes as people are younger. But as we get closer to puberty, then it's becomes more of a conflict for many people. And so I will often see people present closer to 9, 10, 11 as they begin to enter into more middle school with some of this dysphoria more openly manifest. It was probably internally there all the time, but not as obviously expressed. And it can manifest with anxiety, a lot of social anxiety, social withdrawal, depression. A lot of times there's a lot of body dysphoria, meaning that there's a lot of internal hatred to how their external body looks because it's so different than how they feel internally. And that can manifest with cutting or lots of different behaviors. So I would say gender dysphoria expresses itself in many ways. Sometimes it manifests with people becoming hyper, with a sort of hyper feminine or masculine to the sex assigned at birth to try to overcompensate for the fact that their gender is not what the sex they were assigned at birth. So sometimes there's a hyper feminine or a hyper masculine, and even some internalized transphobia. So there's sometimes that happens initially as they begin to grapple with it. So it's expressed in so many different ways. And I think it's partly to just be open and listen when somebody comes in, and to begin to explore gently. This is a hard topic for many people, and they're not ready necessarily always to reveal all their struggles. And what my job is, first and foremost, as a caregiver and also as a parent, is to create a kind, open, loving, non-judgmental, safe space for them to begin to explore and to talk about and work through some of the things that are difficult for them.
Well, and as you've mentioned, this isn't necessarily a binary situation either. And so there are a number of people who may identify as transgender male, but may still choose to wear dresses sometimes, or may still choose to polish their nails, and they don't necessarily choose all of the kind of social trappings that go with a binary gender assignment. And so this is again new learning and new opportunities, I think, for youth. And I certainly now have a number of very dear transgender adult friends too, and it's been interesting to hear about how their journeys have progressed over time. I do know that a number of people face unknowns when they decide to come out as transgender, and they don't necessarily know with clarity who will be aligned with them or be supportive of them. We hope that everyone listening will take some nuggets so that when this happens in your life, you find you have some tools to be able to show up for your friends and family. But what kind of advice would you offer to a parent to offer support to their child or their child's friend if they come out as transgender? And particularly because we're talking about a youth group, in the 0 through 18 category, what are things parents can do to support their kids?
Yeah. I think there's so many. I would say, first and foremost, you have to know yourself, because your children are looking for you to care for them, and it is our role as parents to care for our children. And I think it's important for us to know our own internal transphobia, if we have it, our own internal struggles with our own identities, whatever they may be, to really understand a lot about what our expectations that we have put on our children that are really ours, not theirs. And that's really hard as any parent, regardless of anything. And then I think that's important to remember. I always love the Sweet Honey in the Rock sang this song, which is, your children are not your children. They're the sons and daughters of life longing for itself. And I think that is such a beautiful thing as a parent for me to always remember, regardless of gender identity issues, because that's really, our children have to define who they are for themselves, not, I can't define it for them. And so I think it's hard because sometimes our own reaction may inadvertently be harmful to our children. And not because we had an intent, but it is something that we didn't expect or weren't aware of. And I had mentioned earlier, before starting to record, that I'm a openly gay man, and I have 3 children. We've co-parented with 2 women, so we have this very diverse family. And I work as a physician and care for patients who are transgender. And I myself was sort of surprised when my child came out as transgender. So we're human, and we have to understand that. And as parents, to be okay with that. It's okay for us to do our own process. But it's really important that process is done separate from our children, meaning that they don't have to be responsible for my feelings. My job and role is really to care for them. And so as a parent, it's really important to know yourself, do your work, honor your own struggle, honor your own mourning or loss, because you did have expectations and those are different. And even any change, even change for the better, is stressful. We understand that from a neurochemical point of view. And so it's really important that you do your work so that you can be open and present for your child as they're doing this incredible job of trying to figure out this life that was given to them that presents a lot more hardships than I ever experienced.
Well, and what you mentioned about your work, and your work being separate from your parenting journey with your child, there are a lot of ways that we can do our own work as parents. We can join support groups. We can seek out literature or learning. We can talk with professionals in our community, whether it's a doctor or a counselor. And I think that it is certainly not a failing in any way for parents who are exploring how to support their child to also seek their own emotional supports outside of supports they might be trying to get for their children. Because you're right, you can't process all of your own feelings and make your child go on your own learning journey.
Right.
Your kid has already got there. Your
Right.
kid has learned this about themselves. And so sometimes it's a process of catching up.
And that's the process of catching up is key, because sometimes what I would speak with our youngest about is, I said, you have probably been aware of this as far as you could be aware of it. It's only recent to me, so I do have to do my own journey. And I have that open conversation. It doesn't mean I don't love and support you. It just is a matter of time for me to catch up. And I think that's a beautiful way to put it. So sometimes it is having that conversation. And nobody is patient enough when they are ready. It is our job to work hard to catch up, right? That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But it is understandable that we need to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, so much of our children's lives are controlled by us as parents. We choose who they spend time with when they're not at home. We give them freedom or lack of freedom to be engaged in other activities outside of the household. But one area where children often have their own community is at school. Mm-hmm. And we have less control over what that community looks like. And we have less ability to also protect them from things that may come up in that environment that we want to make sure that they have experiences in a positive way. So as you think about advice that you would offer to other parents about supporting their children in the school environment, what role do you think parents need to play in the school environment to ensure your children have success there?
I think first is talk with your child. How is school going for you? I mean, I really sort of at the end of the day, and to notice how it seems, right? For your child. And there are going to be many subtle and not so subtle cues about how it's going. And then you advocate for your child. And that means going and speaking with the teachers or different professionals within the school, at school boards, whatever it may be, to help them understand how do you create a safe environment for our kids. And that is key. I think it is helpful to find other parents as well so that you can support each other, because it can be an uphill battle, because it is something that many people have strong feelings about, mostly because it is something that's unknown to them. And the unknown is often frightening. And when we respond in fear, we often don't respond well. So some of it is helping to educate and being open about it. That's part of these podcasts are very important that way as well. So it's not something to be fearful of. It's something to maybe be curious about, and then also to take joy in, because it is part of human diversity and the beauty of it. And I think that creation is incredible, and I love the fact that we have all the diversity that we do. And so I think it's changing the narrative. There's so much narrative out there about fear and otherness, and truly we have been part of, and people who have been transgender or gender non-binary have been part of human existence since human existence, right? And I think when we allow for all people to flourish, everybody flourishes. And so again, having open conversations, and I can be a papa bear when I need to, so sometimes you have to be forceful and advocate. And yet I really find that you can really have people begin to open up by just having open conversations and explaining in a way that seems much more familiar and something that they can identify with as well.
I've also discovered that there are some helpful tools that we can use with our schools or counselors to provide support for children who are maybe not, who are going through the experience of coming out. For example, Gender Odyssey has a gender planning tool that is free on their website that you can download. And I have found that teachers and administrators in our community have been open to using that to help guide the conversation and help us anticipate unknowns that may be out there. For example, overnight school field trips. How is that handled? How is your child supported in that environment? How are your child's pronouns commonly known across all of their classes? How can the school support your child when the school yearbook comes out? If they've transitioned and changed their name from September until June, your child may have a very dysphoric moment if something is produced and distributed to everyone that doesn't reflect who they are anymore. So there are so many people, I think, who want to support kids, but in a lot of these environments, we're still just learning how to do that.
And you're right, and we have to learn to navigate those things. My youngest was traveling, and because they haven't done a legal name change, all the documents have to be under their dead name. And the school that they're traveling with was very open and had created the reservations under their chosen name. And then when they went to the airport and in security, it actually created a real dysphoric moment for our youngest, and it's something that I didn't even anticipate, right? So it's really beginning to learn to navigate. And now when we travel, until there's a legal name change, we are now prepared, and we talk with our youngest about how is it going to feel. How do we first of all quicken the process of doing a name change, but also until that's done, to allow you to experience things, what can we do to work through some of those things? And you troubleshoot quite a bit because it is a lot more to navigate. Mm-hmm. And so that's a part of the process too.
Mm-hmm. For some people experiencing gender dysphoria, they seek gender-affirming care. And what does that really mean? And what kind of care is it? And when do minors qualify for this care if they need it or their families choose to pursue it?
So gender-affirming care is when any person can enter into an environment where they'll be accepted for whatever gender they do identify as. And there are many ways to help make the environment a safe space for people, but also to allow them to have access to important health care. Because we can see what's happening throughout this country, that many people are no longer allowed health care for their gender identity and their gender journey, and also obviously for reproductive health care. So creating a gender-affirming environment in our medical community is very important. And there are many ways to do it. So my badge will have my identified pronouns on it. So it immediately shows somebody when they enter in and they see me, they are at least aware of mm-hmm. that I should be inquisitive about what your gender pronouns are, not assuming. And we have ways to change our electronic health record now to put in the chosen name, even if it's not the legal name, so you can begin to make sure that when you call somebody from the waiting room, you're not dead naming them, because that already will create stress in that environment. We try to do education to everybody in our medical group, from the front staff to our medical assistants, to the nurses, and to the other providers, on how to provide appropriate care for our patients. And that includes vocabulary, to understand what the different terms mean, and also educating and providing access to gender-affirming care, whether or not be hormones or other options for surgeries as it may come to. And we want to make sure that our patients have access to resources. So from things like binders to hair removal to other providers who can provide some of the gender-affirming surgeries, such as facial feminization surgery or top surgery. So whatever it may be, we want to make sure that we have access to resources that we can provide to our patients, so there can be as seamless as possible access to the different care that they would require.
Thank you. Now, as we talked a little bit about some of the issues that transgender youth and community members seeking gender-affirming care might need or desire, maybe can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the mental health issues that sometimes also co-occur with gender dysphoria?
Yeah. I think there's been a pandemic of anxiety and depression since the COVID pandemic. And so as part of Bainbridge Youth Services, we identify that there is an incredible need for care for our patients who are suffering from anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. And so people who are transgender will experience those same issues. It's confounded by the fact that often there is this gender dysphoria, which can make any of those things much worse, or it's an added burden to what they're already struggling with. So we can see, again, different manifestations, whether or not be cutting behavior, eating disorders. I have patients who are transgender male, patients who don't want to have their menstrual period, and as a result will not eat in order to prevent having menses, because that is very disturbing and dysregulating for them. Again, cutting behavioral self-harm and suicidal ideation, because often they feel trapped with no escape. And that is why the work that we do as parents and the work that I do as a medical professional is to make sure that it never gets to the place where these children don't feel isolated, alone, and hopeless, because there's so much we can do to help them live their authentic selves. We also see there seems to be a large proportion of patients who are also on the autism spectrum who also identify as transgender. And so there is also other issues that we need to understand as medical professionals and as mental health professionals to help navigate some of those issues as well, because there seems to be a large number of patients who, I call it neurodiversity, that our brains are diverse and they may not identify in a in a way that some basic forms of cognitive behavioral therapy would be helpful for. So you have to understand the way that patients think and understand and process in order to provide resources that are accessible to them.
Oh, that's such a good point. And I had read something recently about the significant crossover between the autism spectrum and the gender spectrum. And there is very significant overlap between both of those sort of spectrums. Let's talk a little bit about the current day environment, from bathroom bills to medical care, school sports. Topics around the trans community are making national headlines. I'm happy to live in Washington. They are making positive headlines in Washington. But I would love to hear a little bit more about what you can highlight for listeners about what are the rights and protections offered to transgender residents in Washington.
Thankfully, we do live in the state that we live in, and so we are, I believe, and you may have more research on this area than I do, I believe that there's a lot of, it is mandated through many insurance companies if they practice in Washington or offer insurance in Washington to provide transgender care as part of the care we give to all our patients. So we're very lucky when it comes to that. There's the SHIELD law now, which helps protect providers who do provide that care, because there are many states, including bordering states, who actually will have criminalized the care we provide for our patients. And so what the SHIELD law does is a shield that protects medical providers if they do provide that care for these patients if they cross the border into Washington state. And that is really important because we need to make sure that people don't stop providing this care. In fact, we need to educate more and more people to provide this care. I'm very fortunate I was able to attend, and I'm a member of the World Professional Association on Transgender Health, and they have yearly updates. Basically, it's the standard of care guidelines, basically. And it's a group of different professionals who come together to help provide evidence-based medical education and services to providers so that we can provide this care not just in Washington, but throughout our country and around the world. And, I'm very fortunate because I love science and I believe in evidence-based medicine. And so we make decisions based upon these things. Where we don't have the absolute evidence, we do consensus. So we have a lot of people getting together to say, okay, we provide this care. What is your understanding? What we can do as professionals, our observations, and we are always curious and work with it. And we want to make sure that we can continue to provide the appropriate medically sound care for our patients because they need it and deserve it. And that harkens back a little bit to your question earlier about what time do you initiate some of this therapy. And we can understand, again, I think gender identity is also diverse. And so some people will say, from the moment I understood gender, I was, this was my gender. Other people really come to it a little bit later, and they may come to it closer to adolescence, especially when their bodies begin to change, and suddenly there's an awareness that my body feels very different than who I identify as. And so some people will say, well, then you're not transgender because you haven't had this fixed understanding of who you are since you were 2. And that's not the case. Again, there's a diversity of our own understanding about our gender. As far as when we initiate care, there's a lot of ways when people identify as transgender, puberty can be very, very difficult, because suddenly your body is really changing into something that you do not identify as. And that's when we see so much of the crisis that comes up about it. And thankfully, we have medications that help suppress puberty. And so what that basically does, it helps prevent these individuals from developing the secondary sex characteristics. So in other words, your voice doesn't drop if you are assigned male at birth and you identify as a trans female. You don't then develop broad shoulders, or if you are assigned female at birth but are a transgender male, you don't start having your period, or you don't develop breast tissue, because those things can be so difficult. And how we came about and understand this, these medical techniques, is actually it's been around for ages, because we have something called precocious puberty. Some people start going through puberty too young, age 5 or 6.
Oh, wow.
So we understood that there's a way to suppress puberty. So we've used this technology forever. And now we can apply it to those people who are identified as transgender earlier to help prevent the development of some of these secondary sex characteristics, which are much more difficult for patients to grapple with, and often to treat later on, because they will often require surgical intervention or other more invasive medical intervention to have their body more aligned with their gender identity. And typically what that does is it suppresses the development of puberty. So, but we don't necessarily, or we don't typically initiate any cross hormones at that time. Cross hormones would be the hormones that you would actually choose, or that are aligned with your gender identity. So if you are assigned male at birth but identify as female, then the cross hormone would be estrogen that you would take to feminize your body. If you're assigned female at birth and your gender identity is male, testosterone would be your cross hormone. So that's how we would explain it. Typically what we would do is, at age 12 or 13, when most people begin to enter puberty, we could suppress the puberty from progressing. And typically, and again, when I look at the standard of care guidelines, around 15 or 16, we would then begin to initiate the cross hormones. And that's because, in general, most people go through puberty between 11 and 14. That's sort of the typical time period. And we also want to make sure that as we initiate the cross hormone, that we first do no harm. And this is always this balance, because first do no harm. If we don't allow for them to get access to hormones, we know that the suicide rates are much higher in transgender youth than in any other group. So I have to make sure I'm not doing harm by withholding. And yet we also want to make sure that we don't initiate some process that can cause emotional harm later on. And so as a medical provider, we will work with a whole group of professionals. So we work with our parents. First of all, we work with the patient. We work with the parents. We work with counselors. We work with endocrinologists. So we try to work with a whole group to make sure we're supporting our children in the best way possible.
And when children do use puberty blockers, just to use a shortcut term there, that process is a pause button. That if you remove the puberty blocker or stop taking it, the child will proceed with a regular puberty.
Correct. Of
their sex assigned at birth.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it is not something that, as soon as you withdraw it, you would then enter into the puberty that your current hormones would normally dictate for you. And so it is something that is quote-unquote reversible and not permanent. It puts a pause. So just like if you were 5 years old and started going on puberty, you'd put a pause on that. And around 12 or 13, you take away these the puberty blockers, and then you would proceed through puberty. And so there are some health issues that as medical professionals we are aware of. The biggest one is really bone density, because during puberty, your sex hormones, so your estrogen or your testosterone, actually help develop your bones. And if we're pausing that, then you don't develop some of the bigger bone density. Now, the cross hormones can help with catch-up later on, but if you're missing 2 or 3 years of that, there is a potential for some osteoporosis or osteopenia, thinning of the bones. The other thing is we do know that if you are putting a pause for this person, but everybody else has not put a pause on their puberty, neurodevelopmentally, the sex hormones affect our brain. It changes us. So what are we doing in that moment, and how do we balance out the benefit for our child versus any potential neurodevelopmental shifts that can happen? And again, thankfully, there's a lot of diversity in puberty. So Dr. Worth, who's one of my colleagues, has this wonderful picture of people who are 13. And it shows a whole spectrum of people who are 13. And some of them look like little kids and some of them are shaving, right? So that's the advantage. So we have some window, and that's why when we look at the consensus about when we would initiate cross hormones, it's typically around 15, because at that point, most people would have begun to enter into it. So it's a way that we can provide age-appropriate care. And again, always looking at first do no harm. My job is to care for my patients in the best way possible.
Well, I appreciate your rundown on all of that. And I have one final question. In conclusion, what are some of the really special and unique talents that you see coming from the transgender community? And how can cisgender folks be good allies to our community members and our children?
That's a great question. And there are probably a lot of different answers, so I'm going to give my one. I mean, I think that we live in a very gendered society, and that has held so many people back. So to have a group of people that can push those boundaries and really blow up the notion of what gender is, it opens us up to so many other wonderful things in our own lives. It has helped me look at my roles that I felt forced into, and now as a parent, I'm like, well, I don't need to feel that. My youngest would always say, you're like the mom in the family. And I'm like, what does that mean? I don't really know what that means. But yet I should take joy in that. That's a lovely thing, because all of us are much more diverse than we often, than sort of the cultural or societal standards allow us to be. I would say that my child has taught me so much about just being open in general. Like, to not have assumptions about who people are, regardless of your gender, in so many other ways, really helped open me up to that experience of really, I did a lot of work on mindfulness, and they talk about a child's mind, coming at everything as something new and open. Don't immediately assume so much, right? And allow somebody else to help guide you through that process, to share in that amazing sort of discovery of something new. There is this, when I see a patient, in order for them to qualify for gender-affirming care, I have to go through a criteria which is based upon the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that's created by the Psychological Association, and it goes through gender dysphoria criteria. And one of them is a question about, do you identify with the typical feelings and emotions of the opposite gender, or the gender you were, the sex you were assigned to at birth? And I always thought that was the weirdest question, because I don't really gender emotions. Why should the emotions be gendered? And I realized, again, this is helping us really combat some of these assumptions. And truly, I'd love to live in a society where, who cares? I mean, we are amazingly diverse, and we can appreciate everybody for who they are and all the beautiful ways they express themselves. And it should never be threatening to us. I'm not sure why people get so threatened by somebody else's expression of their gender. And so I think I rambled on a little bit, partly as a parent and partly as a physician, but those are the ways I think that members of this community and my own child have really opened me up more to, I would say, God's diversity. I am spiritual, and I feel like that is the most amazing thing, is to really recognize how incredible all our creation is.
Oh, I have so much appreciation for everything that you just said, and I think about some of the learning that I've been doing this year. I'm challenged by a cohort of Black community leaders that I've been collaborating with about exploring how my professional practice can become not just allies to that community, but to become activists, to become abolitionists. Mm-hmm. And so as I think about being an ally to the trans community, I am also challenging myself and my family members to think about, like, what does it mean to be an abolitionist? What does it mean to have something at stake? And I have learned through this process that giving people the chance to show up has been one of my best learnings. By putting it out there, I have seen family members go to their churches, their conservative churches, and ask for the church to fly a flag in front of the church, to be a beacon of welcome to those people. And communities that maybe didn't feel like they were included. So I think that's a wonderful way to end.
Well, and I so thank you as a parent, who just loves their child. And we just want to create a world that's going to be loving to their child, but also allow them to express all the beauty of who they are, so they can shine. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Brynn and Dr. Tomberg, for allowing us to be part of your conversation today. Thank you all who have joined us. We hope that this conversation proves to be of benefit to you in your parenting, and we leave you with the foundation that healthy youth begin with healthy families, and healthy families build healthy communities. BYS is a nonprofit organization that is supported by community members like you. For more information, please visit AskBYS.org. We thank Milagro Castilleja for producing our show. Another big thanks to Martin, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network, for their generosity in allowing us to record in their media arts studio.